All right, so I see that we have two agenda items. Plan for getting rid of legacy MCP.
Yeah, we were wondering. So we noticed that Galley isn't using the new incremental or like the sync and source MCP yet. And then I guess, yeah, just what is the plan for phasing out the legacy MCP?
Okay, so we can talk about that, and then the other one was Navy conventions. Is there any topics?
Second.
Were there any topics we wanted to add, or we can just dive in?
We can dive in here, and then I'm sure more topics are going to come up. So the legacy MCP is flag protected at this point, right?
Well. So which branch are you looking at? Are you looking at the master or the release 1.1 branch?
I've been looking at both, but I guess these days I've been looking at master.
So I think it would be safer to look at release 1.1 for now.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what state master's in. And there is some talk about, because we're focusing all of our development on 1.1, master can be kind of out of sync, and it's just kind of in an unknown state. So for MCP in 1.1, so kind of summarize what's in there now and tell me if that this matches up with what you've seen. There's an old kind of client server code, which we can call the old stack. And then there are these source sync packages, which is the new stack. They're both still in 1.1, but everything should be hooked up to the source sync packages. The client server or the old stack is there for posterity for now and as a reference, but that is not used. It's dead code at this point.
You're not using that in Galley?
Correct.
So there's a branch divergence at this point. I believe Andy used to do regular merges from 1.1 to master, and I believe at some point it was stopped, but we keep checking in code to 1.1. And for all intents and purposes, the old stack should be considered as defunct at this point. So the old stack is there, flag protected. It's kind of as a way to say, look, if you find something egregiously wrong with the stack, the new stack, you always have the option of, falling back to the original one, which was baking in the branch for some time.
Yeah.
Okay, but plan of record is actually just to get rid of it by 1.1 release.
So we were kind of phasing it in. We put we did some refactoring work, which I think had been CC'd on. Then we put in the new stack, and then we switched everything over to use the new stack, and we were letting that kind of bake for a little bit. And then the final step would be to remove the old stack. So any changes are going into that.
And is the plan for that all to happen before the 1.1 release?
I don't see why not. At this point, I think that would be.
Yeah, so even if we end up shipping the old stack with 1.1, that will be more of a vestige rather than something that's done deliberately. Like as I said, the whole plan was to switch to the new protos, to the new model for the 1.1 release, and not have the backward compatibility burden, right? That was the main reason that we want to have that all of it in 1.1, right?
Yes.
And we want to actually get rid of it. It's just that I don't know how that's going to work out with the release process, right? So if the release process allows it, you're going to get rid of the old stack.
So then the new stack or the source sync, I don't know how familiar you are with that or what the differences are. We could talk about that a little bit. Would be useful.
I guess the one bit that I would like clarification on, and maybe you can just confirm, the idea about like the source client server and then the sync client server is the idea, like that's also related to reverse proc MCP?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's kind of stepping stones here. There was, in order to make this, in order to have meaningful names and not for things to be confusing, we renamed, so we didn't have the server sending the response and the client sending, the client sending a response and the server sending a request. So we'll just do all the renames just once and make everything consistent, even if we don't hook all of it up. So the source sync stack is there. Forward MCPs that we're still using. There's some code, some dial-out code that we added that you could kind of use for reverse direction, but that's not anything that's being used in OSS for now. One of the other intentions for the source sync was that we would be able to reflect status from Pilot back to Galley. None of that is, kind of the architecture work is in place, but none of that is hooked up. So there's basically feature parity with what we had before, but with the final API names. And then in addition to that, we also have this incremental option that is off by default, but it's plumbed through now. So if we want to or need to turn that on incrementally, we're in a good place to do that.
And I heard that the plan was to also turn incremental MCP changes on by default for Galley. Is the plan the same for Pilot?
I don't know if that will be on in 1.1.0, but it's code complete, and we have stress tests at that level. It's the sort of thing that we could turn on in a point release. So if we see that there's a performance issue, or if somebody wants to turn it on in their own deployment, like Cloud Foundry, it's at that point it's a configuration change. Say I want to enable support on the server. And then I also want to enable support on the client or Pilot. And if they both agree, if they both negotiate that they want to use incremental for a particular request, then that should just kick in and work. But out of the box in the first one release, it's off. Just to be conservative and say this is what we've conceptually been testing for the last 3 months. We'll just ship with that unless there's a performance reason to turn it on.
Okay. And the next item is actually something I added with regards to naming conventions, and it's relevant to what we were talking about a second ago. So with release 1.1 and, the protos being named what they are, how flexible is that going to be after release 1.1? For instance, there's something called like the new resource source client.
Yeah. Are you asking, are we going to change anything?
It'd be nice to, so as someone who is trying to develop using those naming conventions, I found it very difficult to talk about.
Yeah. So our plan was all these naming changes, we wanted to get, if we were going to do that, we wanted to do it before 1.1, because that's when officially that is no longer a pre-alpha API. So I think at this point, any change we make, we need to be very careful about backwards compatibility.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. So I don't think we'll change it. In terms of what we actually ended up with, that seemed to be the least horrible version of all the options we could come up with. Because at least the notion of source and sync seemed to be, that's kind of a well understood concept generally. It does get a little confusing. Yeah, I agree. When you have a client, so you have a client source, but it's the sync. So
the source client is a client of a source, and then a sync client would be a client of a sync.
So the way I've looked at this is in forward MCP, Galley implements a source service. It's a service that provides the source of configuration. And then if you want a client, you would create a client of that source service. So if you look at in the sync package, which implements the sync functionality, it implements a client of the source service. Which is like, I have to really concentrate when I say that, otherwise I'm going to mess it up. So I think that's, yeah, but the alternatives that we could come up with were not any, like I said, that was the least worst of all of them.
Is there any way you'd be open to adding like a for in there? Just, like a client for source or a client for sync, or, just some amount of.
Are you asking about the API or the packages?
I'm asking about the API.
The API is about server itself, right?
So the pack. No, I'm talking about the packages.
Okay, so
Okay.
yeah, so packages, I think that we have a lot more freedom there.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's easier to do. I think there's a lot of work, or there's work that we're starting to do. I'll say we're starting to do in master. Master's not probably not the best place. There's things that we're targeting for post 1.1. Nino's making some rate limiting changes. There's probably additional refactoring that we can do as they grow, and doing these renaming changes to make it clearer to the users. Sounds like the sort of thing that we'd want to do there. So yes, I think that would be a reasonable thing to consider.
Okay.
Yeah, I think like the check-in bar right now for the 1.1 branch is pretty high. And if you try to do any like refactoring changes, it's probably not going to land. But I think for post 1.1, that's entirely feasible, right? Because as long as we don't change the API, we can't change the client libraries. And
Well, I guess one sticking point on the API though is still the new resource source client and the new resource sync client, which, I mean, but that's nitpicking, and if it's going to be harder to change, then
you should have seen the intermediate documents that we went through when we were trying to design this.
that's fair.
I mean, I would be more than happy to put a comment that said, "This is, I'm sorry."
Yeah, if we could put an apology in there.
An apology. But yeah, I think we can probably add additional documentation to make it a bit easier for new people coming to that. And if there's things we can do in the package level to make it more obvious which goes with which, that's all reasonable. But I think the same comment about backwards compatibility applies, but we probably have more freedom there. So we can do either aliasing or kind of wrapper functions to migrate over. Because at least internally we know within Istio proper, we know if we're gonna have a code, a build breakage, but you're consuming this package externally, and other people might be as well. So I think we have to be thoughtful of that. We have some stronger guarantees about that this package is an external package.
Yeah. So the XDS documentation actually becomes much easier to grok with the diagram that they have. Maybe we can add a diagram and maybe have a public MCP page or something like that.
That's
helps.
something that is reasonable to do for 1.1. We have the design doc. So there's something in the doc with sequence diagrams.
Right.
I think what we need to do is put that into the Istio API repo, so it's just in one spot. So when you browse the protos, there'll be some cross-referencing, and you can see some more explanation of what source and sync is, how it maps to client and server.
So I think one thing that I want to call out as something that's not obvious, but as part of the API is the name of the collections. Right. They have also changed, and we should try to be very careful about changing that in a backward compatible way. Right. So I think I'm just putting it out there because not only the API protos are subject to backward compatibility concerns, but the collections, the types of protos in the API repo are all subject to the same thing. So yeah. All right. All right.
Great, thank you.
Okay. The right one.
Get the right handle in there.
Okay. Is there any other topics that you guys want to discuss?
I don't mind talking about, is there any update on the XDS? So I made a PR a little while ago about the XDS updater in core data model, which spiked up quite a bit of conversation. I believe it's PR 10994. And just wanted to get some status on that. I was really hoping if I could talk to Nate in this meeting to get some updates, see what's happening, where everything's at.
10.994.
Yeah.
Okay, we can. Yeah, Nathan is not here, but so this is for the pilot. Okay, we can definitely pull him in. He's not going to be in this meeting, but we can have a separate chat about this. I'm not familiar with this one though.
So I think this is going. Okay, so this is targeted for 1.1.
Initially it was, I believe, but I think at this point, with regards to service accounts not even being part of, or I think actually Android, she made that change.
Yeah. I guess that's what you have to talk with Nathan about if we target 1.1 or master for this.
Yeah.
I think at this point it might be hard to target for 1.1. This one.
Yeah, I think that's something between
Okay.
Nathan and Constant and Andrew to discuss.
Okay. All right. Okay. Anything else?
So, Tucker, you said that Pivotal was going to be spending more time contributing. Were there areas that you were looking at on the config area, or were you looking for work? What's the? I think you're on mute.
Yeah, that's still up for debate. I think right now we're just trying to move everything over to not use the legacy MCP. And then at that point, at some point, we're going to be more interested in scaling and stress tests. But I believe that work is already happening.
So you're using the server library of MCP in your product, right? So as you're...
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so I talked about this a little bit yesterday. There is some kind of medium scale benchmarking and stress test that we have for MCP. It's specifically just at that layer, but it helps kind of characterize the delivery mechanism. And it gives you more confidence whether you want to turn on incremental, when you'd want to do that. I think the part that we don't have today in Istio is a end-to-end, targeted end-to-end scale test that we can repeatedly run. We have large scale testing that we do, but it's more of just all of Istio, and it's not specifically about like I want to dial up. It's not fully parameterized to dial up configuration churn across all collections and the number, higher number of clients. And I think it focuses more on pilot and less on galley, which I guess maybe you don't care about as much. But if you for the part that you're consuming from Istio, we have benchmarks and stress tests for.
Okay.
What kind of numbers are you looking at for your stress tests?
It's at this point, well, we're looking to make sure we're not leaking anything, which is kind of the low bar. To understand what the memory characteristics or the resource characteristics are. So how much memory per client, how does that scale? If we increase the number of collections, which was previously the number of types, how does that scale? How do we handle errors of NACs? So if clients are NACing because the configuration is valid or because they're requesting an unknown collection, how do we handle that? So we leaking resources, and does it kind of scale the way we expect it to? Do we see that we're getting consistent state delivered end to end? So spin up a server and it can just start pumping updates through and fanning that out to a number of clients? Are the clients receiving what they expect? With the idea that changes can be accumulated on the server, and so a client may skip updates, but it's all eventually consistent that the client will end up with the right end state. So there's some checks there to kind of hash over the current snapshot and see that things, regardless of how I got it, whether it was a full state delivery or an incremental update, the end result is consistent with what the full view on the server was. So there's various parameters that you have. There's some built-in tests and benchmarks. There's parameterized if you want to run additional experiments for your particular deployment scenario. You can get a sense of how that looks. The issue I think we found in Istio in Pilot was a resource. We were doing an excessive number of garbage collections because of how Pilot was, how I wrote the initial code in Pilot to parse the incoming event stream. And so it's that kind of problem where you see an excess number of garbage of memory allocations and subsequent garbage collections. That's the sort of issue we're looking for.
So the things that we essentially we are using micro benchmarks at this point, and they're very development focused, right? So they're not the numbers we're not trying to collect numbers for ops purposes at this point. So is there, what is your interest in this? And are you looking at overall performance improvements, or is there an ops numbers that we should generate out of this? What is there?
I was curious if you had already generated numbers out of it. I think we'll learn more as we go.
Okay.
Just wanted to mention something here real quick. What is the long-term plan for these micro benchmarks? Is this something we might want to consider run sort of pre-submit, so we can actually generate ourselves some sort of baselines maybe over time?
It's very hard to actually run the micro benchmarks reliably for CPU measurements. For memory measurements, they are pretty solid, but for CPU, the numbers are so bad. I did this for Mixer. When we were doing the micro benchmarks for Mixer, we cannot create gates out of them unless we really have extremely long running stuff on very consistent deployment settings. Right? Does it make sense?
It sort of does, but so I remember a couple of months ago, I think Jason and I were talking about writing the same sort of micro benchmarks, but it was just service entries only to produce pprof data. And is this something because the micro benchmarks, they're not exactly giving the numbers that we're looking for, or is it basically what I'm trying to say? Is there a difference between writing them as a test or as a benchmark? Is that why they're generating the inconsistent CPU results that you're looking for?
So it's mostly about the executing. I'm sorry, in the micro benchmarks, it's mostly about the executing environment, right? So you will see that if you have different developer machines, you will actually have big percentage differences in execution times, for example. So when you want to create a gate out of it, it's very hard to actually make sure that the execution environment is going to be pretty much equivalent from test run to test run to establish a gate on it. Does it make sense?
Got it. It's just the nature of the environment that they're actually running on the CI, essentially.
Right. Yeah. So, we can create the benchmark, and every developer can run it on their local machine, and then you can look at the delta from one to the next, right? So that actually is pretty useful to show the impact of your particular change, but it requires a certain level of developer involvement, or some making sure that it's a discipline, right?
I think so. The perf and scale group, they have a perf gate. They run this sort of thing for other parts of Istio, and I think the idea is that you have a kind of dedicated environment to that testing, either dedicated machine or dedicated set of VMs. But clearly doing on Circle CI, we see cases where because it's heavily virtualized, you see second delay sometimes in tests. So if we're relying on sleep, the tests become very flaky. In a benchmark environment, that's not going to be flaky, and the test isn't going to fail, but you're going to get really skewed results. So we could set this up as a post-submit test or have a dedicated machine that's just periodically running these. That would be, I think, something that you could get a reliable, consistent result out of, but it would be on that particular machine. Because then if I run it on my machine, with however reduced number of cores, that's going to be much different than if I run it on my laptop or a dedicated test machine.
Yeah, that's what I was mainly curious about as a long-term plan, like some sort of a pre-submit or post-submit perhaps, and then you would just run on a dedicated machine to create some baselines essentially.
Yeah, I think what we discussed is we get the test in, and at least we run it manually. That's something useful, even if we have to run it manually. But it's mostly automated in the sense that you just run the test and you have to interpret the results, and then from that we can spend just more time to hook that up into a CI.
So if you guys are interested, by the way, just for the memory usage aspect alone, it is possible to write gating benchmarks. Like, we can write benchmarks, and if you just measure the memory usage or the allocations and have a gate out of it. I actually had some scripts for this from like almost a year ago, but I didn't create a gate with them, right? So, I mean, we can definitely resurrect them and try to create a gate with those.
We have some, we do functional, we'll fail functional tests right now. The test I pointed you at yesterday, to make sure that things are consistent. Mm-hmm. So you could extend it there and say, if you know what the expected resource memory usage was, if we do the math for that, then we can get added into that section.
Cool. One more thing, in terms of instrumenting those stress tests right now, is there a priority to throw some instrumentation in there?
To throw more instrumentation in there, I think that would be...
Yeah, like in terms of metrics, because I don't think those stress tests right now, they produce any metrics.
No, that would be, I think extending that would be great. And that's the sort of thing, because it's a test that we could argue we want to put into 1.1. Clearly, if it doesn't touch any production code and it's just tests, I think that's the sort of work we want to be doing. So not only is it encouraged, it would be you go into 1.1 and then it'll end up in whatever release master branch is in the future.
So do you have any particular metrics in mind?
Not necessarily. I was just looking at the stress package yesterday for the very first time, and I was going through the code, and I was like kind of thinking some instrumentation would be nice. I'm not even too sure what's available right now. So in terms of metrics.
Yeah, I think we don't have any particular metrics. We're more looking at the high level.
Well, I mean, there's, in the very general sense of the term, we have counters for, at the client, a per client level, and we kind of sum it up at the end. So it's a crude version of metrics, but it's maybe not capturing everything. So we look at the ACK and NAC count. What else? Number of updates applied. But we're not doing complex analysis on that at this point. We kind of dump out at the end and say, here's your target NAC rate was 10%, or 1%, and then we can see that, that's actually, the clients produce that, so that's consistent. And you can see the number of snapshots the server generated versus the number of snapshots that the client applied, and whether all those updates were consistent. That should always be consistent. So I think there's some, but we don't have the, there's more that we can do. We could also integrate the MCP metric itself and capture that. Right now we just have an in-memory version, but we're not reporting that. So we could also dump that out.
Feel free to contribute.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things that, especially in the config group right now, we are having problem, which is lack of resources, so to speak, to get some of these things done. We want to get a lot of things done, right? So somebody actually stepped up to do the client libraries for us, which is great, right? And like if this is a particular interest area, like getting the numbers, help is appreciated.
If people on our team are interested in contributing, what else is available?
So right now, our main focus is essentially releasing 1.1, like making sure that we have the testing in place, like integration testing, stress testing, and perf testing are all like high priority items. The more we can get it done, the more I think we have. We can depend on MCP, right? I think that would be the common goal here. And if we can get that from that point on, beyond 1.1, we can look into like enhancing things, enabling incremental by default, or coming up with the versioning model, essentially how we can do some of the versioning operations. We have some plans for in Galley. I think we will need to coordinate on those. Like how do we do up or down version conversions, right? So I think once 1.1 is shipped, we can sync again and maybe have a more granular work breakdown, and that work.
Great, thanks.
All right. Any other topics? All right, then. See you guys in 2 weeks.
Thank you all.
All right. Bye. Bye.